Who is the oldest unmatched fighter? Well, let's take a look at that. Hey, this is Jeremy with Poindexter G, and today we're going to take a look at the age of all the different unmatched heroes. Now, I'm not talking about the age as far as like how old they physically are, but like when was this character created, or when did this person do the things that they did that made them famous, if it's a real person. Now, before I go through this, there's going to be a few caveats here I'm going to throw in. First of all, this list is happening. This is after the Witcher sets have released, so everything up to the Witcher will be included. I'm also going to go ahead and include announced sets. So, Battle of Legends Volume 3, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Ali versus Lee, and Rosie the Riveter will all be included in this as well. For real life persons, rather than using their birth date, I'm going to try to use the date of when they did the thing that made them significant and made them famous, or when they started to do that, if they did it over a very long period of time. For a lot of these characters, it gets complicated to nail down a specific date for many of them. Some of them, we have things referencing them for the first time at some point, but also recognizing that they were stories that had been told orally over time, and being able to track how far back that went can be very difficult. We also have some characters and legends that evolved over time, so figuring out when they became the character that we recognize them as is kind of subjective. What I'm going to do is pick a major date to use to represent them, and any other type of backstory, any other legends or significant things about them in different places, I will go ahead and mention that as well to try to give as complete of an answer as I can. We're going to do this chronologically, so we're going to start with the youngest or the most recently created character, and then we're going to go all the way back. So the most recently created hero in Unmatched is Ms. Marvel, or specifically the Kamala Khan version of Ms. Marvel. She was introduced as a short cameo in 2013 and finally took on the mantle in 2014. 2004 gives us the introduction of the Winter Soldier, and already now I'm going into its complicated territory. The Winter Soldier was introduced in 2004, but was later revealed to be the character Bucky Barnes, who was Captain America's sidekick, who was originally introduced in 1940. If we were to use that 1940 date, then Winter Soldier would be the oldest Marvel character in Unmatched. In 1997, the television show Buffy the Vampire Slayer premiered. In that original pilot episode, we were introduced to the characters of Buffy, Willow, Angel, Xander, and Giles. Later in 1997, Spike was introduced, with Faith appearing in 1998 and Tara in 1999. The television show Buffy the Vampire Slayer was loosely based off of the 1992 film of the same name. In 1995, we have our first really recognizable descriptions of the Chupacabra. There were earlier accounts of some things like the Chupacabra in 1975. Chupacabra, of course, means goat sucker and originates from Puerto Rico, but eventually spread into other Latin America countries. It was kind of turned into this little tale that you would tell children: be good, or the goat sucker will come and get you. We're pretty sure that the Chupacabra dates back well before this date, but knowing the exact date is going to be difficult to pin down. 1993 gave us the premiere of the classic film Jurassic Park. The depiction of the Jurassic Park characters that we see in Unmatched, Ellie Sattler, Ian Malcolm, and Robert Muldoon, all come from that film, as well as the T-Rex and the Raptors. And while the Unmatched depictions are clearly based off of that film, the original novel was from 1990. Also in 1993, we have the first mass publication of The Witcher. The characters of Geralt, Ciri, Dandelion, Yennefer, Triss, and the Ancient Leshen all start from those original publications, with Philippa and Dijkstra coming in 1994, and Eredin and Aharquax coming in 1995. The first short stories were published in some magazines in 1986 and were eventually compiled and published later, eventually later translated from Polish into English in the 2000s. And what most people are going to recognize these characters from is going to be the video game series that started in 2007. In 1991, in Marvel Superheroes Volume 2, Number 8, we have the introduction of Squirrel Girl and her squirrels. Also, another Marvel character, Deadpool, was introduced in 1990 in New Mutants 98. Deadpool, of course, was originally kind of a spoof of the DC character Deathstroke, which you can look at the names, Wade Wilson versus Slade Wilson, and the colors of the outfits, and yeah, they were clearly going for that. Of course, it would take some time for him to evolve into the wisecracking merc with the mouth that we are all familiar with. In 1984, we have the comic series created by Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which is where the characters of Leonardo, Donatello, Raphael, Michelangelo, and the Evil Shredder all originated. The character of Krang is an invention of the 1987 animated series, which is what I will think of every time any of you mention Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And starting from here, we are going to have a big roundup of a bunch of Marvel characters. 1981 gives us the introduction of Cloak and Dagger, originally from Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man. 1980 gives us the introduction of Elektra in Daredevil number 168. The organization The Hand and its associated ninjas came along later in 1981. In 1979, we have the introduction of She-Hulk in her own comic line, Savage She-Hulk. 1975 is the introduction of Bullseye in Daredevil number 131. Moon Knight was introduced in 1975, interestingly in Werewolf by Night. 1972 gives us the introduction of Ghost Rider, and this is another little bit complicated date because the Redemption Row box on the outside of it states that it is Johnny Blaze that is Ghost Rider, but the bike depicted in the artwork and on the mini is very clearly Danny Ketch's bike. Now, many have speculated this was probably done because that's a much more simple design, so the art design is going to be a lot easier using that. In any case, Danny Ketch did not come along until 1990, so I'll let you decide where to put Ghost Rider. 1972 gives us the introduction of Luke Cage in the comic series Hero for Hire. His sidekick Misty Knight was introduced in 1974, but was retconned to be a character from 1971. In 1966, in Fantastic Four number 52, we have the introduction of the Black Panther. His sister Shuri was not introduced until much later in 2005. 1964 gives us the introduction of Black Widow in Tales of Suspense. Her sidekick, S.H.I.E.L.D. agent Maria Hill, and later acting director of S.H.I.E.L.D., did not come along until 2005. In 1966, we have the first of many appearances of the Mothman in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, where he became quite the legend for that area. 1964 gives us the introduction of another Marvel character who came along in his own line, Daredevil. Now, in the 1970s, we start to see the first written reports of the Bloody Mary folklore. Now, these were things that were written of people trying to find out the origins of it. This was something that they had known from their childhood. So we know that the Bloody Mary myth that we see now existed at least prior to the 1970s sometime, so clearly into the 1960s, possibly earlier than that. That is where you speak her name 3 times in the mirror and she shows up and does something. There were some other Bloody Mary-like myths around in the 19th century. Some things where a young woman could like walk up backwards up the stairs with a candle and then look in a mirror and see the face of her future husband. The moniker Bloody Mary, of course, comes from Mary, the Queen of England, who was coronated in 1553. In 1964, we see the first of many film and television roles for the martial artist Bruce Lee. He went on to have several big films that he was in. Bruce Lee was born in 1940, and if we use that date, he is actually the oldest licensed property in Unmatched. 1963 introduces us to the Marvel sorcerers Doctor Strange and Wong in Strange Tales number 110. And wrapping up our Marvel characters, 1962 gives us one of the most famous superheroes of all time, Spider-Man in Amazing Fantasy number 15. The boxer Cassius Clay won the boxing light heavyweight gold medal in the 1960 Summer Olympics. Soon after that, he switched over to pro, where in 1964 he had a very famous boxing match versus Sonny Liston, which gave us this photo here that you see. Sometime after that, he changed his name a couple of times, eventually settling on the name that he would be best known as Muhammad Ali. The 1950s gave us the rise of the science fiction B movie. One of the most recurring villains in these B movies would be Martian invaders. Now, while the Martian invaders that we see in Tales to Amaze are more designed after these 1950s B movies, the idea of the Martian invaders goes back to the 19th century through a number of works there, the most prominent being the 1897 novel War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. 1943 gives us the comic book characters Jill Trent and Daisy from Fighting Yank number 6, and you are hard pressed to find any information about her because when you look her up on the internet, usually the number one thing returned is that she is a playable character in Unmatched Adventures Tales to Amaze, which is not helpful to me at all. In 1943, a piece of art was commissioned for a poster. This is the famous We Can Do It poster, which was actually commissioned by Westinghouse and not the Department of Defense. It was done as a way to help motivate their employees for the war effort, particularly women. Years later, this poster is much more well known by the name given to the woman depicted in it, Rosie the Riveter. In 1930, Suzuki Ichiro and Takeo Nagamatsu created the world's first superhero Ogam Bat, known here as Golden Bat. 1928 gives us the first usage of the word Sasquatch. Now, this word was derived from a Native American term used for that creature. It would be sometime later in 1958 at a particular site where the name Bigfoot, which is what we know it much more as nowadays, where that name first came along. The Native Americans have stories of a Bigfoot or Sasquatch-like creature going back many, many years, and actually some of the earliest European settlers and explorers on this continent also have depictions of the tall, hairy creature being seen. Now, Bigfoot's sidekick, the jackalope, that name first comes from the 1930s, where some taxidermists started taking jackrabbits and putting horns on them and calling it a jackalope, just smashing those two words together. Stories of horned rabbits go way, way back, all the way back to the 13th century, so the idea of the horned rabbit is kind of a very old thing. In 1899, we have Harry Houdini having his first big break. Now, he had gone and started his career in 1891, had chosen the name Harry Houdini, which was not his actual birth name. He would go on from 1899 on to become quite famous. And now we're going to see 4 works that came out very close to each other that were all put together in the same Cobble and Fog set. In 1897, we have The Invisible Man, penned by H.G. Wells. In 1897, we have Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, Dracula himself took some inspiration from Vlad the Impaler. Vlad dating back to the 15th century. The word vampire first started showing up in the 1700s. and inspirations for a vampire-like creature go back to the 12th century and possibly even further back than that. In 1887, Arthur Conan Doyle introduced us to the characters of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson in the story A Study in Scarlet. And in 1886, Robert Louis Stevenson penned the story The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In 1884, the Serbian scientist Nikola Tesla came to the United States. This was when he started his career working with Edison General Electric and eventually with Westinghouse, where he went on to invent and show off a lot of crazy different things. In 1872, Lewis Carroll's story Through the Looking Glass introduced us to Alice, better known as Alice in Wonderland. The poem The Jabberwocky, which is where the Jabberwock comes from, is a poem that is featured in that same story. Now, a character that we cannot find a specific date for is Annie Christmas, also known as Flatboat Annie. Some of the first stories that we see of her talk about legends of her that came back from some time. We know based off of the context of what was going on in there that this would have had to be the latter half of the 19th century, so sometime from the 1850s and 60s onward. 1770 gives us the publication of the first stories featuring Sinbad. These would have been in 1001 Nights or 1001 Arabian Nights. Now, this is a work that was kind of a hodgepodge of a bunch of different stories over time. Some of these going back to the 14th century and moving on. We don't see Sinbad in these until very late into things. The actual story of Sinbad would be set in the 8th and 9th century. In 1716, Edward Teach becomes a privateer. Eventually he becomes captain and becomes a very well-known captain going by the name Blackbeard. In 1709, we have the first story of Aladdin being published, which is where the modern idea of a genie comes from. Now, the Aladdin story very likely existed sometime prior to this, and the idea of genies, and especially the idea of jinns, go way back, some of those being in the 6th century, and those 6th century accounts, once again, talking about them as if they are something that had been around and talked about for some time. So the idea of a genie is really a pretty old idea. It just evolved over time into what we know a genie as today. In the 1600s, we start seeing our first actual written down stories of what you would recognize as the story of Little Red Riding Hood. Now, this was a story that evolved quite a bit over time. Now, the stories of a girl wearing red and a wolf that has eaten and taken the place of her grandmother go back to the 900s. So this is a pretty old story, but the specific story that we know that Unmatched references doesn't come along until the 1600s. 1592 is the generally accepted date that William Shakespeare wrote his first play. Shakespeare, of course, created several things. Some of these, of course, becoming unmatched characters. The Wayward Sisters being introduced in Macbeth in 1606, Hamlet in 1600, and Titania and Oberon in A Midsummer Night's Dream in 1596. 1592 has Journey to the West, which gave us the first modern portrayal of Sun Wukong. Now, there were many stories and legends that have been recorded in China going back about magical monkeys and things going back to as far as 700 BC, which is way back. But those were not something that you would recognize as Sun Wukong as we know him. They were just kind of like proto-Sun Wukongs. This is something you're going to see happen a lot as we start getting into this point in history. These stories are passed along orally and change over time. In 1551, we have the rise of Oda Nobunaga. This was the year that he became the head of the Oda clan. He went on to become the warlord and daimyo and tried to be the great unifier of Japan, which he came about that close to actually getting accomplished. And we have a character here that's difficult to pin down because we have like a 400-year window where she originated from, and that is Yanenga. Now, the people there in that part of Africa talk about her as if she was an actual historical figure, and there very likely was someone that Yanenga was based off of. The story of Yanenga, of course, changed a lot over time. And once again, I'm putting her here at 1400, although she could have been back as far as 1000. It's just really impossible to tell. 1370 gives us the first reference to Robin Hood in the work Piers Plowman. Now, this is interesting because the reference to Robin Hood here is not the Robin Hood story, but just kind of an aside mention to Robin Hood as if Robin Hood was something that people would know, which implies that Robin Hood, the story, had been around prior to 1370. Of course, since the story features some real life or real world figures, namely Prince John and King Richard, we know that the story was set between 1189 and 1199. In the 1200s, we start seeing some of the first Norse works being written down, one of these being the character of Loki. Now, once again, Loki very clearly existed in some form prior to this, but we don't know exactly how far back. In 1180, in the Genpei Wars, we have Tomoe Gozen. Now, Tomoe Gozen is first mentioned of the Tale of the Heike in 1330. This is an interesting work in that it does have a lot of very correct and very historical information in that. However, it also features a lot of very fanciful things that clearly did not really happen. And so being able to tell what in there is real and what in there is some sort of fanciful legend is going to be very difficult to parse out. It's accepted that there probably was a Tomoe Gozen, but we don't know absolutely for sure. So it's a little bit questionable, but probably. Sometime around the year 1000, we have the epic poem Beowulf, which also mentions Wiglaf in it. Now, this epic poem is set in the 5th and 6th century. Beowulf, we're assuming, was probably another oral story that had been passed down over time. So, exactly how old is Beowulf? I don't know, sometime before 1000. In 830, we have the first mention of King Arthur. This is the Historia Brittonum. King Arthur was supposed to be from the 5th and 6th centuries. Exactly when his story started being told is another one of those we're not exactly sure. The character of Merlin didn't get put together as Merlin until sometime in the 12th century. So sometime later than King Arthur, Merlin was added to the story. Although Merlin himself was based off of, or at least inspired by some other characters and some other legends. So once again, this becomes a little bit of a crazy mismatch. And finally, we are getting down to our last three characters, which are all tied. These are all going to come from around 700 BC, which I want you to understand that Arthur was 830 AD. This is 700 BC, so we're going back like 1500 years here. And these are going to be our Greek characters from the Battle of Legends series: Achilles, Medusa, and Pandora. Now, Achilles, his story, which does feature Patroclus in it, was set sometime in the 12th or 13th century BC. So we're talking a good 400 years prior to when it was written down. These are all going to be things involving the city Troy. We know that that event did happen in real life. Did it go down the way that Greek legend says? But Achilles and Patroclus have both been inserted into that story. Medusa and her sisters that were Gorgons is something that had changed over time. There's some very early stuff that shows that just like the female demons like that Medusa eventually came from had been around prior to 700 BC, but once again, going to be very difficult to pinpoint when that started, and also pinpoint to when it evolved from just generic female demon to the Medusa that we know now. And the story of Pandora is that she was actually the first woman that was created and was just given the box, or a jar as it was actually in some of the earlier works, and was told never to open that, but did end up opening it out of curiosity. Some parallels to the Adam and Eve story. But in any case, we really are going to have a hard time telling how far any of these go back at 700 BC. Now, we know that Sun Wukong, the very earliest stuff about him, was coming around at this same place. It's possible that some proto Sun Wukong predates these, but at 780, we actually have the recognizable characters here of Medusa, Achilles, and Pandora. So that's why I'm going to give them the tie for the oldest unmatched character. So that's the list that we have going on here. Is there somewhere in here that you think I'm really, really wrong? Well, go ahead and drop that down into the comment section and let me know. While you're down there, you can go ahead and give this video a thumbs up and a like. Hey, look at that. And you can also subscribe to my channel. Make sure you catch all the videos that I post so you don't miss anything. This is Jeremy with To The Tabletop, and we'll see you around next time.